Late November 1950, with the world still recovering from World War II, and after responding to the communist North Korean military's invasion of democratic South Korea, June of the same year, UN forces, 90% of which were Americans, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, had pushed back and driven the retreating North Korean forces deep into the heart of their own country. With the war all but over, and within just days of a final offensive operation to have UN forces, specifically the United Nations 10th Corps, consisting mainly of US Marines and some US Army, settled in for the night around a place called Chosin Reservoir, deep in the North Korean territory. What they were about to learn is that they were surrounded, not by the retreating forces of the North Korean military, but by the 9th Corps of the People's Republic of China. What would follow was a 2-week battle that would go down in history as one of the bloodiest and historically intense battles in United States military history. This is the Battle of Chosin Reservoir.
Can you keep a secret?
Changing hearts and minds.
Changing hearts and minds.
Welcome to Change Your POV podcast. You're listening to Changing Hearts and Minds, a show about reviving the warrior spirit and remembering the past to improve our future. I'm your host, Jeff Adamick. Let's get this party started.
Ladies and gentlemen, am I totally screwed or what? You're funny.
I want to discuss all this behavior.
Let me out of here!
This is Movie Tone. Lionel Gamlin reporting. Following the Chinese nationalist expulsion from China, the threat to Formosa, the long drawn-out battles in Malaya, Indochina, communist attacks, in fact, throughout Southeast Asia, there comes open aggression in Korea. Here, the Russian-dominated North Koreans launched a full-scale, well-prepared drive on the capital of the South, Seoul. The peaceful southern democracy was taken by surprise by this communist blitzkrieg, culmination of red aims in the Far East that are perfectly clear for all to see. It is tragic indeed that war should strike the South Korean people so recently recovered from Japanese occupation and ill treatment.
On 25 June 1950, Communist North Korea, with the support of both the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea.
In the absence of Soviet obstruction, the Security Council voted overwhelmingly in favor of armed intervention to protect the Korean Republic. It was the first police action sanctioned against an aggressor by the Parliament of Nations.
Although the United Nations Security Council rapidly reacted to the invasion with a 21-nation coalition to deploy and face the North Korean forces, after 2 months, the UN forces were at the point of defeat. The entire UN force had been pushed back to a small area known as the Pusan Perimeter. With over 89,000 strong man army, North Korea had advanced across most of the Korean peninsula. The unprepared South Korean army and the recent numbers that had been cut from the U.S. military combined with antiquated weapons and equipment equaled a disaster for the 90% filled American UN forces.
During the early days of UN action, General MacArthur fought a grim defensive battle. His troops outnumbered 3 and 4 to 1. Stubbornly, forces under his command clung to a shrinking beachhead in Southeast Korea, and for months the Allies fought to keep from being driven into the sea. This, a savage war of attrition, in which no quarter was given by a foe equipped with the latest Russian armament. It was, in fact, a war of survival to gain time. The cost was high to Americans who bore the brunt under the UN banner. For here they faced an enemy who ruthlessly slaughtered prisoners, many with their arms bound. Scores died before red guns as they stood helpless. Yes, the cost to free men came hideously high as they bought time on the rapidly narrowing perimeter of their defense. In the first months of conflict, casualties mounted with terrifying speed.
North Korea was equipped with hundreds of Soviet and Chinese-supplied T-34 tanks. Also, Soviet and Chinese advisors helped the North Korean forces not only to have the upper hand in regards to equipment and weapons, but with tactics and leadership from many World War II experienced advisors. In the first months of the war, casualties mounted. UN forces reportedly had 6,000 casualties, and the South Korean army reported casualties in excess of 70,000. The UN forces commander, General Douglas MacArthur, filled his 10th Corps with the 1st Marine Division, which was manned mainly with reserve Marine units, and a minimally manned U.S. Army's 8th Army. With these, he put into action a planned amphibious assault at Incheon in an attempt to cut the North Korean supply lines and to attempt to retake the South Korean capital of Seoul. This operation was called Operation Chromite. Incheon was a very heavily defended, and although many of his staff in planning, along with Navy Admiral James Doyle and his Director of Naval Operations, Admiral Forrest Sherman, questioned the possible chances of successfully completing the operation, MacArthur offered his reasons for such a daring choice. The North Koreans would not anticipate an attack there because of the heavily secured and defended positions. Any successful landing and push at that location would avoid a long ground push through South Korea during what would be no doubt a brutal winter. MacArthur won over Admiral Sherman and received the President's endorsement and authorization from Washington, D.C. to go ahead with Operation Chromite. On September 15, 1950, 75,000 troops, 261 naval vessels began the operation. 2 weeks later, the South Korean capital of Seoul was recaptured. On 17 September, Kimpo Airfield, a strategically significant target, was also captured by the UN forces. With repairs and continued focus by MacArthur's plans, the airfield was fully operational by 22 September, and at that time was unloading some 6,629 vehicles, 53,882 troops, and 25,512 tons of supplies for the continued war effort to push North Korea back.
In Korea, United Nations troops push on in the cautious advance against the communists. An advance whose purpose, General Ridgway states, is not to seize ground, but to wipe out the enemy. The Chinese Red Army, fighting desperately in small isolated stands, prefers to give ground on wider fronts rather than join battle. And it's up to the infantry to clear out the pockets of die-hard communists. With the enemy falling back, the United Nations commanders had expected that the Reds would make their stand there. But under a steady, withering barrage, GIs are able to cross the river and establish a beachhead.
President Truman, along with many top leaders at the Pentagon and the UN Security Council, were well aware of the political importance to keep the UN, and especially the US forces, from pushing their operations too far past the 38th parallel into North Korea. The Chinese Premier, Chairman Mao Zedong, was also aware of MacArthur's open disdain for the Chinese communists, and was amassing his own forces on the border, in the regions of North Korea and China. President Truman even officially informed MacArthur to not push US or UN forces into North Korea too far, that only South Korean army would be authorized to push into the north to pursue retreating North Korean forces. MacArthur felt he knew better than the president. He also chose to ignore intelligence reports about growing numbers of Chinese People's Army units having not only massed along the Manchurian area, but also pushing down into North Korea, and were staged within the area to make a deliberate fight with UN forces should they pursue the fleeing North Korean army. By mid-October 1950, after the successful landing at Incheon by the U.S. 10th Corps and the subsequent destruction of the Korean People's Army, the Korean War appeared to be all but over. United Nations forces advanced rapidly into North Korea with the intention of reuniting North and South Korea before the end of 1950. North Korea is divided along the center of its own country by an impassable Tibet Mountains, which separated the UN forces into two groups. The U.S. 8th Army advanced north through the western coast of the Korean peninsula, while the Republic of Korea, 1st Corps, and the U.S. 10th Corps advanced north on the eastern coast. At the same time, the People's Republic of China entered the conflict after issuing several warnings to the United Nations. On 19 October 1950, large formations of Chinese troops, dubbed the People's Volunteer Army, or the PVA, secretly crossed the border and into North Korea. One of the first Chinese units to reach the Chosin Reservoir area was the PVA's 42nd Corps, and it was tasked with stopping the Eastern UN advances. On 25 October, the advancing ROC, Republic of Korea First Corps, made contact with the Chinese and halted at Fuchilin Pass, south of the Chosin Reservoir. After the landing at Wusan, the U.S. 1st Marine Division and the 5th and the 10th Corps engaged in defending the PVA's 124th Division on 2nd November, and the ensuing battle caused heavy casualties among the Chinese. On 6 November, the PVA's 42nd Corps ordered a retreat to the north with the intention of luring the UN forces into the Chosin Reservoir. By 24 November, the 1st Marine Division occupied both Sinhu-ni on the eastern side of the reservoir and Udamni-ni on the west side of the reservoir. Faced with the sudden attacks by Chinese forces in the 8th Army sector, General Douglas MacArthur ordered the 8th Army to launch the Buy Home by Christmas offensive. General Douglas MacArthur, continually ignoring the orders from the President of the United States and the own intelligence that was being manipulated by Mao Zedong, as he was basically moving into a baited ambush to the Chosin Reservoir. This would lead to a situation that would not only change the face of warfare for the United States of America, but also lead to the downfall of one of its most decorated and celebrated generals. On the evening of 27 November 1950, just as the 8,000 Marines at Udamni were settling in to get a last full night's rest prior to offensive push towards the Yulu River, as many began to fall asleep into a bitter, cold evening air, random shots rang out. Shortly after that, they were followed by flares being fired up into the night sky, bugles, whistles, and then the war cries of waves of oncoming Chinese communists from the entire corps of Chinese communist soldiers that had secretly been surrounding the entire elements around the Chosin Reservoir. Udamni took the full brunt of the initial attack, and the U.S. Army forces on the eastern side of the Chosin Reservoir were also attacked. As wave upon wave of Chinese communist forces came upon their positions, it soon became apparent to the Marines and the U.S. soldiers that they were not facing retreating North Korean forces, but a organized and well-determined Chinese communist force from across the Yulu River. It has been reported that the attacks came in 3 waves. In the first wave, every soldier would have a weapon. The second wave would come and about half of the soldiers that were attacking would have weapons, with the other half picking up the weapons of the dead soldiers from the wave before. And then the final wave would come, where commissars, as they were called, carrying burp guns, would assault the positions, and they would not withdraw or pull back. The fighting got so intensive and so close that hand-to-hand combat broke out in many places. Many times, the fighting positions claimed that if they had not shot out their barrels, that they found themselves having to turn their barrels around and fire into their own perimeter above the heads of the fighting positions to attack the oncoming communist forces coming into their area. The attack went through the entire night. Many soldiers and many Marines died, and the Chinese losses were mounting even higher. What was kicking off was the Chinese assault and what would lead to be one of the worst 2 weeks in U.S. Marine history.
Okay. But at Chosin, it was November 27th when they hit us. Mm-hmm. The Chinese hit us hard on November 27th. Thousands of Chinese were trying, they had been ordered to annihilate us to the man at the 1st Marine Division. They knew it would be a terrible blow to the country and to morale if they could annihilate the 1st Marine Division. So
the next morning, it became apparent to General Smith that his Marines and the attached Army units were in serious trouble. He had been almost completely surrounded on 3 sides, and although his position at Haguru was not attacked at first, and the fact that it had almost no combat troops present, he knew that it would only be a matter of time before the Chinese forces, which had been estimated at that time now to be over a division-size element, would soon be making their way down to attack him. The attacks did not stop just because the nighttime had ended. Sporadic attacks along the eastern and western portions of Chosin Reservoir continued throughout the night.
We took turns sleeping in the daytime. It was too cold at night. I heard later we lost more people from freezing than from enemy action. Even the mortar rounds froze through the casings. The Chinese had an awful lot of people between us and the beach, but the harbor at Hung Nam was our only way out. All our resupply came by air. Without that, we never could have made it. Same goes for the close air support we got from the Marine Air Wing and the Air Force.
At Hagaru, General Smith knew that he needed to get some reinforcements up. He made a call down to his garrison south of his location, ordering Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Drysdale to put together reinforcements and start making their way to Hagari. That night, at East Hill, which was the high ground overwatching the ammo dump at Hagaru, a massive attack occurred on the hill. The Chinese knew that this location was the most important position at Hagaru, as it overwatched the entire Hagaru area and also the roads going in and out of Hagaru. Since the airfield was not completely finished, all resupplies at the time had to be done by airdrop, which made it increasingly difficult for the non-combat armed soldiers and Marines at Hagaru to hold East Hill. On November 28th at 10:30 p.m., Hagaru was attacked in full force on the East Hill. Again, waves and waves of Chinese forces attacked. Machine gun barrels at the East Hill burned out. The next morning, they found that because of the cold weather, many lives that would have been lost had been saved. Soldiers who should have bled out actually were saved by the freezing of their own blood on their wounds. People who had amputations did not bleed out for the same reason. And as the medics got them into locations where they could start to thaw, they found that many of these men had multiple gunshot wounds that they had not even known about. As they began to thaw, these wounds became evident. At the same time, the U.S. Army forces on the eastern side of the Chosin Reservoir had completely lost contact with the Marines. This created a major problem, as the U.S. forces there had continually been in contact. Coterie garrison, that where the request for reinforcements had been sent, finally came under attack on the third day. General Smith knew what this meant. If his entire forces north, east, and west of his position, including his own position, had been attacked, and now Coterie, which was south of his position, had been attacked, it was evident to General Smith, the Marines, the Army, and everyone else that they were 100% surrounded, and there was nowhere for them to go and nowhere for them to escape. Early on the morning of day 3 at 10 a.m., 922 men left to reinforce Hagari under the British officer Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Drysdale. He departed from Coterie, headed north towards Hagari with 922 troops, 141 vehicles, and 29 tanks to reinforce the 1st Marine Division command post. The Chinese knew that these men were needed desperately at the command post. A deliberate, planned, and massive attack on the convoy ensued almost immediately. The convoy was split in half. Half of the forces that were at the back half had to turn around and make their way back to Coterie. Lieutenant Colonel Drysdale called forward to General Smith, requesting him for direction on what to do, considering they were under such heavy attack. General Smith's order came through loud and clear. Smith ordered the convoy, quote, "Come ahead at all costs." Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Drysdale and the rest of his convoy knew what this meant. 10 hours behind schedule, they finally arrived. They didn't arrive with the 922 troops, 141 vehicles, and 29 tanks that they had departed Coterie with. When they arrived, there was only 16 tanks left and a little over 300 troops. When they arrived, the ground was so frozen that these new soldiers could not even dig in to make fighting positions. That evening, the temperature had dropped to almost negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit. To stop the wind from freezing all the soldiers that had just made the trip north, they had to use dead Chinese stack up and block the wind. At this time, the army still had no contact with Hagari. It was low on ammo and fuel, and it had no food for at least a few days. Resupply drops were coming in, but they were incorrect. 40mm rounds were being sent for 50 caliber machine guns. The Army Division Command flew in on the 4th day. The general from the Division Command gave bad news to the weary Army soldiers. There would be no help coming. They needed to fight their own way out. And then he flew back out again, leaving the soldiers to fight their way out of the Eastern Front. It was about this time that General MacArthur finally showed his face from his command in Japan. MacArthur had gone from almost winning the North Korean War to going into full retreat in only 72 hours. It was at this time that officials ordered to pull all units back to safety. This meant that they had to cross the 80 miles to the Sea of Japan under complete and utter Chinese attack the entire way. Marines began to reconsolidate and pull back all of their forces. It was at that time that the Chinese forces were given the order by Mao Zedong to completely wipe out the entire 1st Marine Division. Back at home, word of the Chinese attack reached the news headlines. Headlines such as 1st Marine Division annihilated and 200,000 Chinese communists surround UN forces made it clear that the news media held little hope for the embattled forces at the Chosin Reservoir. President Truman, his national defense advisors, and the Pentagon were beginning to seriously consider the use of nuclear bombs. Authorization and orders to MacArthur and his staff the complete pullout and return to safety of all UN forces north of the 38th parallel. Although this seemed like a good idea, it would be a little bit harder to get done than just putting out the order.
Well, we stayed and fought for a few more days until we were ordered to go back south to Hungnam.
Okay.
And that's when my major battle was between Hagaru and Kotori. No, between Hagaru and Kotori. The Chinese had everything. The only thing we had was the road to come down, and they had everything else. So they told us when we left that we'd be running a gauntlet of enemy fire, and that became very true.
As the decimated and fighting for their life 1st Marine Division began to make their way through harsh Chinese attacks and incessant cold weather on the western side of the Chosin Reservoir, things were not going any better for the U.S. Army that was fighting its way and fighting for its own survival on the eastern side of the reservoir at the same time. Being told by their Army commanding general to make their way back with no support, and with having no contact with the 1st Marine Division's command because of broken lines of communication, Lieutenant Colonel Faith and his men, who would later be referred to as Task Force Faith, made the decision to try to break out from their surrounded positions and make their way south. They had 4 miles to go to what they knew was a location that had multiple tanks and reinforcements waiting at it. As they moved with over 500 wounded soldiers in vehicles on a convoy line that was under constant attack, they arrived after a very hard push, only to find that all the tanks that they had been waiting to see 4 miles south of their position had all been gone. They had to continue to push 4 more miles to try to make it to Hagari. It was during this time that many of the U.S. Army was overrun and taken prisoner. Many of the wounded who were in trucks died in the trucks. Many of those trucks were caught on fire or blown to pieces with the wounded still inside of them. Although they did have close air support from Marine units dropping napalm on the Chinese forces, they still barely managed to make it back to Hagari. Hagari did have its share of media personalities. When hearing about the reconsolidation of forces from the eastern and western sides to Hagari, a reporter asked General Smith with a sarcastic tone about why Marines were retreating. General Smith advised him that when you are surrounded on all sides, there is no such thing as a retreat. You're just attacking in a different direction. This became very true for all of the forces trying to make their way back to the port. After days of attempting and finally getting everyone from the 1st Marine Division reorganized, after they tried to get them to eat and sleep in some kind of warming tents, they prepared to fight south to the coastline. On December 6th, the attack in a different direction continued. Destination, Kotori, which was 11 miles distance away. The real challenge was the Funchulin Pass below Kotori, where the Chinese had destroyed the bridge over a giant chasm. The solution that they came up with was to assemble a bridge that was airdropped in sections, enough of which survived to allow vehicles to pass over. The vehicles were necessary because of the mass amount of wounded soldiers that could not move by foot. Although the Chinese contested the withdrawal at this checkpoint, the Marines and the Army fought through the trap. Although the rear guard had to abandon 7 tanks, their final potential barrier, another pass to the south, had been cleared by the 1st Battalion of the 1st Marines. In a nighttime attack with the temperatures as low as negative 34 degrees, the battalion of 3rd Infantry Division stopped 2 attacks on the final perimeter in Hungum on December 3rd and on December 15th. Its rear guard having reached Hungum on December 11th, all of the Marines and Army were loaded up onto their waiting transport ships. Resistance by the Chinese had become almost token at that point, and although they expected it, it seemed to be just another day for the soldiers who were there at Chosin Reservoir. The Chosin Reservoir campaign was a geographic victory for the Chinese. For the 10th Corps of the UN forces, instead of redeploying to Busan, they were forced to return to South Korea, where they became part of the 8th Army in January of 1951. All of the actions and fighting had convinced the UN forces that Allied ground troops could defeat Chinese armies, however numerous. The Chinese have remained vague on their losses during the battle over those 2 weeks, but their own records and the UN estimates that the 9th Army Group's casualties of the Chinese army ranged up to 80,000. When one counts the combat deaths and wounded, plus deaths from the cold, the 1st Marines Division lost 4,385 men in combat operations and 7,338 to the cold. The other 10th Corps losses during the Chosin battle amounted to some 6,000 Americans and Koreans. As time went on, the fighting, the heart and soul of the Marines that fought at the Chosin Reservoir cannot be understated. Although many believe it to be a loss by tactical means, there is not a Marine alive today or anyone that has ever seen combat that would tell you that the Marines that fought at the Chosin Reservoir were anything more than heroes. For the Army, for years afterwards, the saga of Task Force Faith had been largely ignored. Many believe that the collapse and panic that engulfed the task force had brought great shame to the Army itself. Upon closer examination, the task force role in the Chosin battle proved to be much more. Many historians now agree that the Task Force Faith blocked the Chinese drive along the eastern side of the Chosin for 5 days, and that allowed the Marines along the western side to withdraw to Hagaru. Furthermore, the task force destroyed the entire 80th Division of the 9th Corps. In recognition of their bravery, Task Force Faith was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation in September of 1999. The list of awards for the Battle of Chosin are phenomenal, if not remarkable. Medal of Honors alone. For the United States Marine Corps, the Medal of Honor was awarded to the following men: PFC Hector A. Caffarata, Sergeant James E. Johnson, Staff Sergeant William G. Windrich, Staff Sergeant Robert Kennemore, Captain Edward Stamford, Captain William F. Barber, and Lieutenant Colonel Ray Davis. For the United States Army, the Medal of Honor was awarded to Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith and Lieutenant Colonel John Page. The commander of all forces, Major General Oliver Smith, was himself awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. And I would be remiss to not mention one of the Marine Corps' heroes, no matter what combat you're talking about. Brigadier General Chesty Puller was commander of the 1st Marine Regiment and was awarded at that time his 5th Navy Cross. There were very numerous Distinguished Service Crosses, Navy Crosses, and Silver Stars that were also awarded that cannot be named. Not to mention the thousands of soldiers and Marines that gave their lives both in combat and to the weather during the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir.
Change your POV and all of its shows can help and heal and even educate. We want you to help us help others. Visit our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/changeyourpov. Become a patron of our network and our mission.